The sharp click of the valet's pen, the faint rustle of designer clothes brushing against polished marble, and the gentle hum of a string quartet created a backdrop of quiet opulence as Julian Clark stood at the edge of the grand garden, the soft glow of fairy lights reflecting off his tuxedo. It was the kind of wedding you read about in glossy magazines, an over-the-top celebration of wealth and perfection. But Julian wasn't here for the champagne or the elegant conversations. The billionaire tech mogul, with his crisp suit and signature Rolex, didn't belong in this world anymore. Yet here he was, because Adam, his best friend since college, had insisted. "Just show up, drink something expensive, and try not to scowl at the bridesmaids," Adam had said, and Julian, too weary to argue, had agreed. His eyes scanned the crowd. The socialites, the influencers, the wealthy power players, all part of the world he had grown accustomed to, but a world that no longer mattered to him. Life had become sterile. Deals, deadlines, endless applause, and still, the ache of loneliness that money couldn't erase. He swirled his whiskey, staring into the amber liquid, lost in thought. And then, he saw her. She wasn't wearing a designer dress or flaunting her figure like the others. Instead, she stood off to the side near the hydrangeas, laughing in a way that felt real, effortless. Her deep mahogany skin glowed in the soft evening light, and her dress, simple, cobalt blue, clung to her like it had been made for no one else. Her natural curls, pinned loosely, caught the breeze, a playful lock falling over her cheek. Julian couldn't look away. Who was she? She didn't belong to this world, yet, in a way, she did. The way she stood, her ease and warmth, spoke of something deeper, something raw, something Julian hadn't felt in years. His chest tightened. He had everything, a sprawling empire, endless wealth, but here, at this moment, he realized just how little it had all meant. And as if she sensed his stare, she turned. Their eyes met. In that brief second, everything else around him, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the wedding party, faded into the background. It was just her. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but in that single moment, Julian knew something that sent a chill down his spine. She was about to change everything. This wasn't just another night. But why was Julian here? Why was he surrounded by this wealth and luxury that only served to highlight how empty he felt? He thought back to the invitation, elegant, pristine, everything he was supposed to care about. But today wasn't about deals or business partners. This was about Adam, who had been like a brother to him through the years. Adam's sister's wedding was supposed to be just another event on Julian's never-ending calendar. Instead, it was the place where Julian's world would shift in ways he couldn't yet understand. If you believe everyone deserves a fair chance at love, comment, "I stand for fairness," and let us know you're not siding with people who think love should be limited by status or background. Hit subscribe to show you're with us and against those who judge others based on their past or where they come from. Only trolls and manipulators will keep their thumbs down. Stand for love. Stand for respect. The soft hum of the string quartet played on, but Julian could no longer hear it. His gaze was fixed on her, Nyla. She wasn't the type of woman who craved attention. Julian could see that even from this distance. She stood near the hydrangeas, the late afternoon sunlight casting a warm glow on her skin. Her laughter, though soft, carried through the air, unburdened by the weight of the world's expectations. She didn't belong to this world of high society, yet she was undeniably part of it, like a rare jewel that didn't need to scream for recognition. He had never been one to approach people without purpose, especially women. His world was one of strategy, not spontaneity. Yet something about her presence pulled at him. He hadn't felt this intrigued in years. He set his glass down on the bar, the sharp scent of bourbon lingering on his tongue, and before he could fully process the decision, his legs were moving, leading him across the room. The closer he got, the more his chest tightened, as though his body was aware of the shift before his mind could catch up. Julian wasn't sure what he expected. Perhaps he'd walk up, offer a casual greeting, and move on. Just another moment in the sea of high society pleasantries. But when he reached her, he was suddenly aware of how out of place he felt. Not because of the wedding or the people around him, but because of the feeling she stirred in him, a feeling he couldn't quite put into words. "Excuse me," Julian said, his voice low but steady. "I don't mean to interrupt." Nyla turned, her eyes briefly catching his before narrowing in mild surprise. There was a moment of hesitation, her body language instinctively retreating, but she quickly masked it with a polite smile. Julian could tell she wasn't used to being approached, especially not in places like this. "Not at all," Nyla replied, her voice smooth and warm. "I didn't think anyone would be looking to talk to me in this crowd." Julian found himself smiling at her honesty. It was refreshing. In a room full of curated perfection, she felt like the only real thing. "I get the feeling no one here is looking to talk to anyone who isn't in the right circle," he said, his tone light but tinged with the truth of his own experience. "But I'm glad I found you." Her brow arched slightly, an amused glint in her eyes. "And why is that?" Julian paused, taken aback by the question. He had expected to make small talk, but instead, he found himself confronting something he hadn't felt in a long time. Genuine curiosity. "I guess it's because you're not pretending to be anything," he said, a little surprised at his own words. "Everyone else here is just performing. You're not." Nyla considered him for a moment, her lips curling into a half-smile. "And you think you're not performing?" Julian couldn't help the laugh that escaped him. It was the first time he'd laughed in what felt like ages, not at something funny, but at the truth of her words. He had built a life based on performance, on being the right person at the right time, saying the right things, doing the right things. But she saw through it, and it was both unnerving and intriguing. "Fair point," he admitted, stepping a little closer, though still maintaining a respectful distance. "I suppose we're all playing our parts." Nyla's expression softened, and Julian could see the trace of empathy in her eyes. It made him feel something unexpected, like she understood him in a way others hadn't, not even his closest friends. "I guess it's easier to be yourself when no one expects anything from you," Nyla said, her voice quieter now. "When you're just here for the moment." Julian nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Yeah, I've forgotten what that feels like." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that invited connection rather than awkwardness. Julian had been surrounded by people all his life, yet in that moment, with her standing in front of him, he felt a sense of isolation he couldn't explain. She wasn't just a breath of fresh air. She was an answer to a question he hadn't realized he was asking. "Do you come to weddings often?" Julian asked, breaking the silence. Nyla let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "Not really. I've been to my fair share, but I tend to avoid the whole wedding season thing. Too much pressure." "I get that," Julian replied, his voice softening as he leaned in slightly, intrigued by her openness. Pressure to be happy for people who look happy when, honestly, they probably just want to enjoy a quiet moment too. Nyla gave him a sidelong glance, a playful glint in her eyes. "You always this philosophical at weddings?" Julian smirked. "Not usually, no. But this one feels different." "Different how?" Nyla asked, clearly interested but still a little cautious. "I don't know," Julian admitted, shrugging. "I guess it's because I wasn't supposed to come. Adam begged me to be here, but I figured it'd be just another event to check off the list. But now that I'm here..." He trailed off, not knowing how to articulate the shift he was feeling. The words weren't coming easily. Nyla studied him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "Sounds like you're not the biggest fan of these kinds of events." No, Julian said, his lips quirking into a half smile. Not really. But it's also not the worst. Her expression softened, almost imperceptibly, and Julian felt a strange pull toward her, a pull he couldn't explain. They were two people, standing in the middle of a crowd, and yet it felt like they were alone in their own little world. "You're a designer, right?" he asked, suddenly wanting to know more about her. "You did the decorations here?" She nodded. "That's me. I helped with the floral arrangements, the tables, everything except the food and the guest list. I mostly work on smaller projects, but this one's been interesting." "Interesting how?" Nyla hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Let's just say it's hard to create beauty in a place where everything already looks perfect. Sometimes it's the imperfections that give a space character." Julian's curiosity deepened. She didn't just talk about beauty. She saw it in a way that was different from the polished world around them. "I never thought about it like that," he admitted, his gaze lingering on her face. "Maybe I could use a little more imperfection in my life." Nyla glanced at him, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. "We all could sometimes." There was a pause, and for a moment, Julian felt like they were the only two people in the room, like the rest of the wedding had faded away, leaving just them, strangers, yet somehow connected. But then, as if snapping back to reality, Nyla stepped back slightly. "I should probably get back to the wedding," she said, glancing toward the crowd. "I've got some things to wrap up before the reception." Julian nodded, though he didn't want her to go. "Of course. I don't want to keep you." "Thanks for the conversation," she said, her smile warm but guarded. "It's not every day I get to talk to someone who actually listens." Julian's heart skipped a beat. "Any time," he said, his voice sincere. As she turned to walk away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had just started, something he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew one thing for certain. Nyla was about to change everything. And for the first time in a long while, Julian found himself looking forward to the unknown. The reception had taken on a life of its own. Laughter bubbled through the air, mingling with the soft strains of a string quartet, but Julian barely noticed. His gaze kept flickering back to Nyla, standing near the edge of the dance floor, her eyes fixed on the crowd but not truly a part of it. She was beautiful, of course. There was no denying that. But it was something more. Something quiet. Something real. Her effortless elegance, the way she stood slightly apart, her body language unguarded but never vulnerable, intrigued him. It was like she was both in the moment and completely outside of it, grounded in a way that made him feel lighter just by being near her. He had been standing at the bar, nursing his drink and observing her from a distance, when the idea struck him like a spark. Ask her to dance. It was ridiculous, of course. He hadn't danced in years, and even when he did, it was more about making an appearance than enjoying the moment. But tonight felt different. And maybe it was the way Nyla seemed to exist in a world of her own. Or maybe it was that thing inside him that wanted to break free from the polished, controlled world he had built around himself. Julian set his glass down and moved toward her, his heart pounding with anticipation he couldn't quite explain. As he approached, Nyla turned slightly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, the world around them seemed to pause. The noise of the party, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, all of it faded away. It was just them. "Would you like to dance?" Julian asked, his voice steady but with an underlying vulnerability that surprised him. Nyla's eyes flickered with hesitation. She opened her mouth to speak, then paused. The music was soft, slow, just the kind of song that invited intimacy, but also exposed any discomfort. Julian could see the conflict in her eyes, the pull between wanting to stay in her own quiet corner and the curiosity that had been building since their first conversation. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice almost too quiet. "I'm not much of a dancer." Julian gave her a half smile. Neither am I. But it's not about being good at it, is it? His voice dropped just slightly, enough to convey the sincerity beneath his words. It's about the moment. Nyla studied him for a beat, then shrugged. I suppose you're right. And with that, she allowed him to gently guide her toward the dance floor. The space around them seemed to open, the light from the chandelier overhead casting a soft glow on her face. Julian's hand was warm against her back, and Nyla, for all her hesitation, allowed herself to relax into the rhythm of the music. The first few moments were awkward, as they both adjusted to the unfamiliarity of the dance. Julian could feel her body stiffen slightly as she tried to figure out the steps, her movements just a touch too self-conscious. But then, something shifted. Slowly they found their rhythm. Nothing graceful, nothing perfect, but it didn't matter. The space between them grew smaller, and they fell into a quiet, unspoken connection. For Julian, it was more than just attraction. It was a rare peace, the kind he hadn't felt in years. It was a sense of release, as though he could let go of the mask he wore so often. No expectations, no demands, just this simple, shared moment with her. As they moved together, the world around them seemed to blur. There were no guests, no fancy decor, no high society banter, just the two of them, drifting through the music, breathing in sync. Julian wasn't sure how long they danced. Minutes? Hours? Time felt irrelevant in that space. He could feel the warmth of her skin under his hand, the soft pulse of her breath in the space between them. Her body fit against his in a way that felt both foreign and natural, and he could feel it, the shift in him, the change that had started the moment they'd locked eyes across the room. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something that had little to do with the wedding or the people around them. It was about connection. His hand moved slightly to her waist, and she didn't pull away. Her head rested lightly against his chest, and for a moment, Julian felt a wave of peace wash over him, something he hadn't known he was missing. In this quiet space, with her in his arms, everything else faded away. The loneliness he'd carried for years, the distance he kept from everyone, even from himself, seemed to dissipate. But then, a flicker of doubt crossed Nyla's face. He saw it in the slight tension in her posture, the subtle stiffening of her body against his. The warmth between them, once effortless, was replaced by something colder, a hesitation, a retreat. Julian's heart skipped. He had been so wrapped up in the connection, in the way her body had felt against his, that he hadn't realized she was pulling back. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle, unsure. Nyla lifted her head, meeting his gaze. Her eyes were searching, conflicted. "I don't know if this is a good idea," she said quietly, almost as though she were talking to herself more than to him. "You and we're from two different worlds. This," she gestured vaguely between them, the moment they had shared. "This doesn't fit." Julian's chest tightened at her words, and the comfortable ease they had shared vanished like smoke in the wind. He stepped back slightly, though his hand remained on her waist, reluctant to let go. "What do you mean?" Nyla swallowed, looking around the room as though seeking an escape. "You're Julian Clark," she said, the words almost bitter in their truth. "Billionaire, tech mogul. Everything you touch turns to gold, and people throw themselves at your feet. And then there's me. I'm just a designer, an interior designer who's barely scraping by." Her words stung, but not in the way he expected. He wasn't offended. He understood her hesitation. They couldn't have come from more different places, and she wasn't wrong. She had built her life on her own, struggling and striving, while his life had been handed to him on a silver platter. He'd never had to fight for anything, not like she had. But what she was missing, what she couldn't see, was that none of it mattered to him. Not the wealth, not the power, not the empire. He took a deep breath and gently cupped her chin, lifting her face to meet his. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. "Nyla," he said, his voice softer now, more vulnerable than he'd intended. "I didn't ask you to dance because I want to add another trophy to my collection. I'm not interested in playing games. I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone. I'm just here, with you. And I don't want you to walk away from something real just because you think we don't fit." Her lips parted, but she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she looked at him as though she were trying to decipher the truth in his eyes. For the first time, Julian felt a shift within himself, something raw and unguarded. He had been so accustomed to putting up walls, keeping everyone at arm's length, but with her, everything was different. "I don't know if I can be part of your world, Julian," Nyla said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've fought my whole life to make something of myself, and I can't just throw that away. I can't be just another woman on your arm." Julian closed his eyes for a moment, letting her words sink in. When he opened them again, he didn't look at the grand ballroom, at the crowds or the wedding. He only saw Nyla. "You don't have to throw anything away," he said quietly. "But I want to know you, Nyla. The real you. And I don't want to lose that." She stood there for a moment, studying him, and for the first time, Julian realized just how much of himself he had let her see. He wasn't perfect, wasn't polished, wasn't the untouchable billionaire he was used to being. With her, he didn't have to be. He could be just Julian. Her shoulders slumped slightly, the tension easing just a little. "I don't know where this is going," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do I," he replied. "But maybe it's worth finding out." Nyla didn't answer right away, but she didn't pull away either. Instead, she rested her head on his chest once more, her breath steady against him. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't smooth. But for the first time in years, Julian didn't feel like he had to have all the answers. They continued to dance, slowly, as the world around them continued on without them. The music swirled, the laughter filled the room, but for Julian and Nyla, everything else had fallen away. It was just the two of them, learning what it meant to let go. In that quiet, intimate moment, Julian realized something important. He wasn't just in this for the moment. He was in it for the future, whatever it might hold. And with Nyla in his arms, for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The following afternoon, Julian and Nyla found themselves at a sprawling estate, one of the many properties Julian kept around the city for business functions and personal retreats. It wasn't quite the grandiose mansion in the Hamptons, but it was a gorgeous property, gated, with manicured gardens and a sprawling lawn that stretched toward the horizon. The walls of the house were lined with modern art, the rooms bathed in soft, ambient light, and everywhere you looked, there was an overwhelming sense of opulence, as though the house itself was a statement, one that told the world, "This is how I live." It was a far cry from the warm, earthy apartment Nyla had grown up in, with her single mother, surrounded by the simplicity of love and hard work. No marble floors, no pristine glass walls. Nothing that glistened or screamed luxury. Julian had invited Nyla to one of his regular weekend get-togethers, a cocktail party with high-profile investors, tech moguls, and a few select friends. He told her it would be low-key, but Nyla knew better. In Julian's world, low-key meant no photographers, at least not that anyone had warned her about. It wasn't the scale of the event that worried her. It was the world she was about to step into. A world where she knew, without question, that she would stick out like a sore thumb. As they arrived, Julian's arm around her waist felt comforting, grounding. His warmth was a reassurance that, at least for tonight, he wanted her by his side. But as they entered the estate, Nyla felt an unease she hadn't anticipated. The glances from the guests were quick, but sharp, discerning. She noticed the way their eyes flicked over her, lingering a moment too long, as if trying to place her, to categorize her. She was used to being judged, to being underestimated. She'd spent her life fighting against the assumptions people made about her, about being a black woman in a space dominated by the wealthy, the powerful, the connected. But this felt different. These were the people who didn't just judge her. They had the power to decide whether she was worth their time. "I'll introduce you to some people," Julian said, his voice low in her ear, as they made their way through the room. Nyla smiled, but there was a tightness in her chest she couldn't shake. Julian squeezed her hand briefly, as if sensing her hesitation, but it didn't ease the storm building inside her. She didn't belong here. And no matter how hard she tried to remind herself that she wasn't here to impress anyone, the pressure was suffocating. "Julian!" a voice called from across the room, and Nyla turned to see a tall, sharply dressed man heading toward them. His dark hair was neatly combed back, and his suit was so impeccably tailored it looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. His eyes, gray, cold, and calculating, flicked over Nyla before landing back on Julian. "This is Ethan," Julian said, introducing them. "Ethan, this is Nyla. She's been helping me with some projects lately." Ethan didn't extend his hand right away, but his eyes were a different story. They swept over Nyla from head to toe, lingering just a beat too long on her dress, a simple black number she had bought on sale at a boutique. She immediately felt self-conscious, as though everything about her was being scrutinized. "It's a pleasure," Ethan said finally, his smile stiff. He offered his hand, and Nyla shook it quickly, trying not to flinch at the chill in his demeanor. "The projects Julian's involved in are impressive," Ethan continued, his tone casual but laced with judgment. "I'm sure you've learned a lot, Nyla." Nyla smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm just getting started," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Ethan gave a thin smile, as if humoring her, before turning to Julian. "You must be proud of her, Julian," he said. His gaze never fully left Nyla, as if trying to find a reason not to be impressed. "It's not easy to break into this world, is it?" The implication hung in the air like a weight. Nyla's stomach clenched, and she knew, without question, that Ethan didn't mean this world as a compliment. He didn't see her as an equal. He saw her as an outsider, a token, something to be measured against a standard that would never include her. Julian's jaw tightened at Ethan's tone. "Nyla's more than capable," he said sharply, a note of protectiveness in his voice that Nyla hadn't expected. She felt a rush of warmth toward him, but it was quickly overshadowed by the tension in the room. "Of course," Ethan replied, his smile barely perceptible. He glanced at his watch, then excused himself, leaving Julian and Nyla standing in the midst of a growing crowd. "I didn't like that," Nyla murmured, her voice quieter than she intended. "I know," Julian said, his hand resting at the small of her back. "I'll handle it. Don't let people like him get under your skin." But Nyla could feel it. She could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders, the judgment, the whispers, the invisible lines that separated her from this life of wealth and privilege. And no matter how much Julian reassured her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this world would never fully accept her. She wasn't naive. She knew what people thought when they looked at her. She'd seen it in their eyes 1,000 times before. The quiet surprise that she had made it this far, the subtle disbelief that someone like her could have a seat at the table. In her world, she had worked for everything she had. Nothing was given to her. And now, in this room, she was realizing that the same rules didn't apply here. People like her weren't supposed to belong. But Julian was different, wasn't he? He had to be. They moved through the evening, meeting more of Julian's friends and colleagues. With every new introduction, Nyla felt more and more like an intruder. She could see how they looked at her, distracted, disinterested, sizing her up. Conversations were brief and polite, but there was always an underlying tension. It wasn't the overt rudeness that people like Ethan wore so easily. It was something more subtle, more insidious. It was the way they spoke to her like she was an anomaly, as if she didn't quite belong in the same space as them. Julian seemed to notice it too. Each time someone made a comment about her background, her work, or her appearance, he grew increasingly defensive. He stepped in a little too quickly to correct them, or he offered a sharp, pointed remark that left people looking uncomfortable. Nyla could see that he was protecting her, but it only made her feel worse. She wasn't used to being protected. She had always taken care of herself. And now, as Julian's world pressed in on her from all sides, the discomfort started to build, slowly suffocating her. The night drew on, and as the conversation became more strained, Nyla found herself retreating into the quiet corner of the room, nursing her drink and watching the crowd. It was all so much. Too much. The conversations, the glances, the unspoken judgments. She had never been part of this world, and no matter how much she liked Julian, no matter how genuine he was, she couldn't ignore the harsh reality. She didn't belong here. Julian found her a few minutes later, his brow furrowed with concern. "Hey," he said softly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You okay?" Nyla gave a tight smile, trying to push back the flood of emotions that were threatening to overwhelm her. "I'm fine. Just not used to all of this." He leaned in, his face serious now. "You don't have to put up with their bullshit, Nyla. You belong here just as much as anyone else." But Nyla shook her head, her smile fading. "I don't know if I do, Julian. I don't think I can keep pretending I fit into a world that's not meant for me." Her words struck him like a blow. She could see it in his eyes, the hurt, the confusion. But what hurt her the most was the realization that maybe he didn't understand either. "I want to be with you," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want this. I want us. But this world—" He paused, clearly torn. "I'm not sure it'll let us be." Nyla's chest tightened. She had feared this moment, this revelation. But here it was, pulling them apart. She couldn't ignore the weight of their differences any longer. The superficiality of Julian's world was a world she could never fully enter. And no matter how much she wanted to be with him, she couldn't change who she was, or where she came from. "I need to think about this, Julian," she said, her voice steady, but her heart was anything but calm. "I don't know if I can keep living in this tension. It's too much." Julian's face fell, but he nodded. "I get it. I do." But even as he spoke, Nyla knew the truth. The more she pulled away, the more the gap between them would grow, the harder it would be to bridge that distance. She wasn't sure if they could make it. She wasn't sure if she could make it. The silence between Julian and Nyla had stretched on for the better part of the week. The last conversation they'd had, just before the cocktail party, lingered in the air like an unspoken agreement that things were becoming too complicated, too messy. Julian could feel it, the distance between them growing with every passing moment. He'd tried to push it aside, tried to let things go back to normal, but he couldn't. He couldn't stop thinking about her. He couldn't stop wondering what would happen if they didn't work through this. The truth was, he didn't want to live in a world without her in it. So, Julian made a decision. That night, after a long day of meetings and conference calls, he found himself standing outside her apartment, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. He had tried calling her, texting her, but she had been distant. Her replies were polite, but they were empty. Something in her tone told him that she was pulling away. The night was cool, a crisp breeze ruffling the leaves on the trees lining the street. Julian's breath came out in soft puffs as he took a few steps forward and rang the doorbell. Moments later, Nyla opened the door, her eyes red-rimmed from what he guessed had been a long day. She wasn't wearing makeup, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, her expression guarded. She looked weary, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked distant. "Julian," she said, her voice soft but strained. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "But we need to talk." Nyla hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering to the door behind her, as if she were considering whether to invite him in. But then she stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in." Julian stepped inside, the warmth of her apartment wrapping around him. It was cozy in a way his penthouse could never be. Small, simple, but filled with the kind of warmth he had grown to admire in Nyla. The air smelled faintly of lavender and cinnamon, a stark contrast to the sterile, polished world he was used to. He felt a pang of longing, but he didn't let it show. Nyla motioned to the couch. "Have a seat," she said, though she didn't sit herself. She stood by the window, her arms crossed over her chest, staring out into the night. Julian watched her for a moment, taking in her posture, the way her shoulders were tight and rigid. He could tell she was trying to maintain distance, trying to keep her emotions under control. But he knew her too well now. He could see through the facade. "Nyla," he began, his voice calm but insistent. "I don't want to do this anymore." She turned to face him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Do what, exactly?" "I don't want to keep pretending like I'm okay with us drifting apart," Julian said, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm tired of it. I'm tired of pretending like this. This distance is fine. It's not. And I don't want to lose you." Nyla's expression softened, but only just. "Julian," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we come from two completely different worlds. You don't understand?" "I do understand," he interrupted, standing up and taking a step closer to her. "I do understand. I understand that you're scared. I understand that I'm asking you to make a choice, and that's not easy. But I'm not asking you to compromise yourself. I'm asking you to choose us. Because I want this, Nyla. I want you." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration so simple yet so heavy. For a moment, Nyla didn't say anything. She just stood there, her eyes searching his face as though she were looking for the truth in his words. "I don't want to be a part of your world, Julian," Nyla finally said, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't belong there. I've spent my whole life fighting to make something of myself, to prove that I'm worth something. And I'm scared that if I get involved with you, I'll lose everything I've worked for." Julian took another step forward, his heart racing. "You won't lose anything," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "Nyla, this isn't about me changing you or making you fit into my world. It's about us finding a way to make it work. Together. We can both be who we are, and it'll still work. But the world you're a part of," she trailed off, shaking her head, "it's so different from mine. The expectations, the judgments. I don't care about that world anymore," Julian said, his voice sharper now but filled with conviction. "I care about you. I'm tired of the shallow relationships I've had, the ones that don't mean anything, the ones that are all about appearances. I want something real, Nyla. And that's you. I know I'm not perfect, and I know I've made mistakes, but I'm not willing to let you go without at least trying. I want us to figure this out. Together." She met his gaze, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also something softer, a flicker of hope, maybe. Julian reached out, his hand brushing hers lightly, and when she didn't pull away, he gently took it in his own. "Nyla," he said softly, his voice quieter now, "I'm not asking you to give up your independence. I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm asking you to trust me, to trust us." Nyla pulled her hand back, her chest rising and falling as she took a shaky breath. "You don't understand," she said, her voice raw with emotion. "I've worked so hard to get where I am. I've built my life from nothing, and I don't know how to fit into your world without losing myself." "I don't want you to lose yourself," Julian said, stepping closer. "But you can't keep running away from this. From me. From what we have." Nyla looked down at the floor, her shoulders slumping in resignation. "I don't know if I can do this, Julian," she admitted quietly. "I don't know if I can be part of your world. It's too much. The pressure, the judgment." Julian stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently lift her chin, making her look at him. "I'm not asking you to be a part of my world. I'm asking you to be a part of our world, one where we choose each other, despite everything else." The silence between them stretched, heavy with the weight of their conversation. Nyla's eyes searched his face, looking for something, anything, to tell her that he wasn't just saying the right words, that he meant it. "I'm not perfect, Nyla," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I don't have all the answers. But what I do know is that I don't want to lose you. Not now. Not after everything we've shared." She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, there was a tear in her eye, one she quickly wiped away. "I'm scared, Julian," she whispered. "I'm scared that this won't work. That I'll lose myself in your world." Julian gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tear that had fallen. "You won't lose yourself. I promise you. I'm not asking you to be anyone else. I just want to be with you, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it work." Nyla's breath hitched as she looked at him, her eyes softening, though still filled with uncertainty. "You're serious, aren't you?" "I am," Julian said, his voice firm. "I'm willing to change. I'm willing to fight for this. For you." She stared at him for a long moment, and Julian could feel the battle inside her, the tug-of-war between her fears and the possibility of something real. Finally, she took a shaky breath and nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. "Okay, Julian. Let's try. But only if you really mean it. Because I won't be just another part of your life that gets discarded when it's inconvenient." "I swear I won't," Julian said, his voice filled with all the sincerity he could muster. "You're not a part of my life that's disposable, Nyla. You're the reason I'm finally seeing what's been missing." Her lips trembled as she smiled, the tension between them finally starting to break. "Then let's see where this goes," she said softly. And for the first time, Julian felt the weight of his own uncertainty lift. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to fight for something real, something that meant more than power, status, or success, something that could only be found in the quiet spaces between two people who truly saw each other. "I'm in," he said, his voice steady with resolve. "Let's make it work." The night of the gala arrived with all the fanfare Julian had predicted. The air was thick with expectation as the glittering ballroom doors opened, revealing an array of celebrities, business moguls, and high-profile socialites, all carefully curated for the kind of event Julian's company had become known for. The venue, a vast and opulent glass-walled space overlooking the East River, was decorated with towering floral arrangements and crystal chandeliers that glittered like stars in the dimly lit room. Every surface seemed designed to make a statement, to scream wealth, power, and success. And Nyla? She stood at the edge of it all, feeling like she was about to drown. She had dressed for the occasion, though she was still unsure how she'd ended up here in the first place. Julian had insisted, "Of course, we're in this together, Nyla," but no amount of encouragement could shake the feeling that she was stepping into a world that she wasn't made for. Her dress, a sleek, floor-length black gown, had been a compromise, something simple and elegant. She'd spent hours in front of the mirror, wondering if she was doing it right, questioning if it was too much or too little. It was the first time she truly felt like an outsider. Julian was here because he belonged. This was his world, his peers, his friends, his people. And then there was her, trying to fit into a world that didn't seem to have a place for someone like her. The chatter of the crowd buzzed around her, and Nyla could already feel the eyes on her, the silent judgment in the air. Whispers filled the space like an electric current, and though no one said anything directly, she felt every gaze that passed over her. The stares, the raised eyebrows. They weren't even subtle. This wasn't her world. "You look stunning." Julian's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her from the wave of insecurity that had begun to wash over her. He stood before her, in a sharp tuxedo, his usual composed expression replaced by a warmth she hadn't seen before. "You're incredible." Nyla managed a small smile, but it was forced, the weight of the scrutiny around her pressing heavily on her shoulders. "Thanks," she said, but her voice trembled slightly, betraying her nerves. Julian noticed immediately. "Hey, look at me." He reached for her hand, his touch grounding. "You're not here to fit in, Nyla. You're here because you matter. You belong with me." She glanced up at him, meeting his gaze. The sincerity in his eyes made her heart ache. She wanted to believe him. She did believe him. But the voices in her head, the ones that told her she didn't belong, were too loud to ignore. "I don't know if I can do this, Julian." His brow furrowed, but before he could respond, the first wave of guests approached. His colleagues, business associates, the people who made up the very world she felt so out of place in. "Julian, so good to see you," a woman said, her tone dripping with fake sweetness as she kissed both of his cheeks. She looked at Nyla briefly, then turned back to him with a knowing smile. "And who is this?" "This is Nyla," Julian said, his hand resting on her back in a protective gesture. "She's been helping me with some of my projects lately." Nyla forced herself to smile, but the woman's gaze flicked over her, lingering on her dress, her face, and then moving on with a glance that seemed to dismiss her entirely. Nyla stood there, trying to hold it together, as Julian continued to exchange pleasantries. But the words faded into white noise, and the realization of just how out of place she was settled into her chest like a heavy stone. As the evening wore on, Nyla felt herself shrinking further into the background, trying to blend in, but it was impossible. Everywhere she turned, there were people who were more polished, more perfect, and they looked at her with curiosity. What was she doing here? She tried to make conversation with a few of the other women, but each one seemed more interested in talking about their latest vacation or the newest designer handbag than anything that mattered to her. She couldn't help but compare herself to them, their lives so effortlessly glamorous, their conversations so surface level. What could she possibly have to offer here? As the night wore on, the weight of the room grew heavier. Julian noticed it too, and he could feel the tension in the way Nyla's shoulders had stiffened, the way she had begun to withdraw into herself. He hated that she was uncomfortable, hated that she was feeling the scrutiny of his world. He knew she wasn't used to this, and the last thing he wanted was for her to feel out of place. He had tried to shield her from it, to make her feel welcome, but he couldn't deny it anymore. His world was doing its best to push her out, but not if he could help it. Later in the evening, the event reached its peak, and a spotlight shone on the center of the ballroom. A host called for attention, announcing the start of the awards ceremony, and everyone turned toward the stage. Julian felt the weight of the moment. He had been nominated for an award for his contributions to the tech industry, but tonight wasn't just about that. Tonight, it was about Nyla, and he wasn't going to let this night end without making sure she knew that. "Nyla," he said softly, leaning in close to her ear as they stood near the back of the room. "Come with me." She turned to him, a question in her eyes. "What's going on?" "I need you by my side," he said simply. There was no explanation, no preamble, just a quiet assurance that this was something he needed to do. Julian led her to the front, guiding her through the crowd, his hand firm on her lower back. As they approached the stage, Nyla felt the full weight of the room descend on her. Every eye in the place seemed to follow their every move. The whispers, the curious glances, it all seemed to crescendo to a fever pitch. She felt the weight of their judgment, of their curiosity. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host announced as Julian and Nyla reached the front. "Please welcome Julian Clark to accept his award for outstanding contribution to technology." The applause was polite, lukewarm. Julian stood there, giving a brief wave of acknowledgement, but then, without warning, he turned to Nyla. "I didn't come here to be recognized for business," Julian said into the microphone, his voice clear and steady. "I didn't come here for any of this. I came here tonight because I want everyone to know who's really changed my life." The room quieted. A slight murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. "Nyla," Julian continued, his eyes never leaving hers, "this woman, right here, has given me more peace and meaning than any deal or merger ever could. She's shown me what it means to be truly seen, not for what I do, not for what I've built, but for who I am." Nyla's breath caught in her throat. Her heart raced as she processed his words, as she saw the depth in his eyes, the sincerity of his confession. For a moment, the room disappeared. There was no one but Julian and Nyla. And in that moment, she knew he wasn't just saying it for the sake of saying it. He meant it. "This woman," Julian repeated, his voice softer now, "is the reason I wake up in the morning, ready to face the world. And I want everyone to know that, because if you don't see that, then you're missing the point of everything." The silence in the room was palpable. Nyla's heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling as she tried to process what Julian had just done. He had just made a public declaration. He had put himself out there for her, for them, in front of his world, his colleagues, his peers, the very people who had looked at her with judgment. He was showing them all who she was to him. And in that moment, Julian gave her something more than words. He gave her the courage to stand tall, to not shrink into the background any longer. The applause that followed wasn't forced. It was genuine. And Nyla realized with a quiet clarity that this was the moment she had been waiting for. Not the validation of the room or the approval of Julian's world, but the simple truth that, in that moment, they were real. And that was enough. As the applause died down, Julian turned to her, his hand reaching for hers. "Are you okay?" he whispered. Nyla nodded, her throat tight. "I'm better than okay." And as they walked off the stage together, hand in hand, Nyla realized that this moment, wasn't just a turning point for them. It was a turning point for her. In Julian's world, she had a place. And it wasn't because she had earned it or fought for it. It was because he had fought for her. And in the end, that was all that mattered. "I'll always fight for you," Julian whispered, as if reading her mind. "For us." And for the first time, Nyla believed him. The days following the gala had been a whirlwind of emotions. On the one hand, Julian and Nyla had never been more certain of what they shared. The declaration he'd made in front of his colleagues had been a turning point, not just for their relationship, but for how they would move forward together. But even as they stood on the precipice of something real, Nyla knew that their biggest challenge was still ahead of them. She had seen the way some of Julian's business associates looked at her after the gala, their polite smiles hiding something far colder beneath the surface. She had tried to ignore the whispers, tried to tell herself that Julian was different, that what they had was real. But now, the pressure was mounting. Nyla sat on the couch in her apartment, her legs crossed beneath her as she scrolled through emails on her phone. She had been busy with work, but her mind kept drifting back to the conversations she had overheard at the gala. Julian's circle wasn't just full of wealthy individuals. They were powerful, influential people, and many of them didn't like the idea of a woman like Nyla. Someone from the outside, someone who wasn't born into wealth and privilege, becoming a permanent fixture in Julian's life. She could feel their judgment, even now. They didn't think she belonged. And the more she thought about it, the more doubts crept into her mind. Was this a phase for Julian? A temporary distraction? She had heard it all before. The well-meaning warnings from people who knew him, who believed that his world and hers could never truly align. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Julian. "Dinner at my place tonight? I miss you." The simple message sent a flutter through her chest, but even as she smiled, the uncertainty lingered. Julian had been so certain of what they had, but Nyla couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was still living in a world that didn't fully embrace her. She had learned to live with the judgment of others, but she hadn't expected it to come from Julian's world, his friends, his colleagues. When Nyla arrived at Julian's apartment later that evening, the first thing she noticed was how warm and welcoming the space felt. Julian had transformed it into something more than just a luxurious apartment. It had become a reflection of the person he was, his tastes, his life. But what she was really looking for tonight wasn't the decor or the food. What she was looking for was Julian's resolve. She needed to know if he was as committed to her as he said he was. "Hey," Julian greeted her at the door, pulling her into a hug. His scent, familiar, comforting, wrapped around her, but there was something in his eyes tonight, something that made her nervous. "Hi," she replied softly, trying to read him. "Dinner smells great." "Just a little something I whipped up," Julian said, pulling her gently by the hand into the kitchen. "We're keeping it casual tonight." Nyla took a seat at the counter, watching him move around the kitchen with ease. Despite the tension in her chest, a small smile crept onto her face. Julian had this way of making the mundane feel special. It was something she appreciated about him. But tonight, she couldn't stop the worry from creeping in. The weight of their relationship, the fragility of it in the face of all the outside forces, was suffocating. Julian turned around, sensing the shift in her mood. He placed the wine glasses down on the counter and looked at her with concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice softer now, more attuned to her unease. Nyla sighed, running her fingers through her hair. "I'm just wondering where this is all going, Julian." "Where it's going?" Julian's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I'm in over my head here. I don't belong in your world, and I'm scared that I'm just a phase, a distraction, something temporary." Julian's expression shifted, his jaw tightening as he stepped closer to her. "Nyla," he said gently, cupping her face in his hands. "You are not a distraction. You're not a phase. You're everything." "I'm not so sure," Nyla replied, shaking her head. "I've heard what they're saying behind my back. I see the way they look at me. They don't think I belong here, and I don't know if you even see how different our worlds are." Julian took a deep breath, his hand still resting on her cheek. "I hear them too, but I'm done caring about what they think. I'm done with that world. It's empty, Nyla. I've lived in it long enough to know that none of it means anything if it doesn't have you in it." Her eyes searched his face, looking for the truth in his words. "But you've been part of that world your entire life," she said softly. "How can you just turn your back on it? What if I'm not enough to make you leave it all behind?" "I don't need to leave everything behind," Julian said, his voice firm, his eyes unwavering. "I need to leave behind the parts that don't matter, the people who don't see me, and the ones who don't see you." "I'm not asking you to change, Nyla. I'm asking you to trust me. I want this. I want us." Her heart ached at the sincerity in his voice, but the doubt that had been gnawing at her for weeks remained. Could she trust him? Could she trust them? It wasn't just about him. It was about her, too. her independence, her sense of self. She had fought so hard to build her life, to make her own way, and the idea of losing that terrified her. "I want this too," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I'm scared. I don't know if I can be part of your world and still be myself. I don't want to lose who I am." "You won't lose yourself," Julian said, stepping closer. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I promise you, Nyla. I'm not asking you to be anything other than who you are. I'm asking you to be with me. To be with us. Whatever that looks like." Nyla let out a shaky breath, the weight of her fears slowly starting to lift. She had never been good at letting her guard down, but with Julian, it felt easier. He wasn't asking her to change. He was asking her to be brave enough to step into a life with him, one that was still uncertain, but also filled with possibility. "I'm scared too," Julian admitted quietly, his voice rough. "Scared of losing you. Scared that I'm not enough for you. But I'm willing to fight for us. I want this to work, Nyla. I'm not just doing this because I'm infatuated. This is real. I want a future with you." Nyla looked up at him, her heart swelling in her chest. She could see it in his eyes, the sincerity, the vulnerability that he had shown her so many times. He wasn't perfect. He had his own fears, his own uncertainties. But right now, that didn't matter. What mattered was that they were standing here, together, and they were willing to fight for what they had. She nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm willing to try, Julian. I'm willing to take that step." Julian's face softened with relief, and he leaned down to kiss her forehead, holding her close. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said, his voice soothing. "But we're in this together, and I'm not going anywhere." The rest of the evening was spent in quiet comfort, a shift in their dynamic. No more doubts, no more distance. Julian and Nyla had come to a silent agreement. They were going to give this a chance. They would fight for each other, for their relationship, and for the future they both wanted. But the real test was still ahead of them. They had made a decision. Now, it was time to live up to it. As they sat down to dinner, the tension between them had finally eased. They were both more present, more at ease. The uncertainty of the past few weeks had melted away, leaving only the sense of possibility between them. Nyla looked across the table at Julian, her eyes searching his face. She saw something there, something deep. "I don't know where this is going," she said quietly, "but I know I want to find out with you." Julian smiled, his eyes warm. "Then let's make it happen." And for the first time in a long while, Nyla felt like the future was something worth reaching for. The soft hum of the car engine was the only sound that filled the air as Julian drove, his hand casually resting on the steering wheel, his eyes focused on the winding road ahead. Nyla sat beside him, her gaze out the window, watching the countryside unfold in a blur of green and gold. The early autumn air was cool, a light breeze tousling her hair as the trees and vineyards passed by. She had no idea where they were going, but somehow she trusted Julian. She trusted that whatever he had planned, it would be something that mattered. They reached the vineyard just as the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the landscape. Julian had brought her here before, on the night of their first real connection, the night that felt like the beginning of everything, and yet at the time, neither of them had realized it. She looked out at the sprawling vines, now heavy with late-season fruit, and felt something shift within her. This place had been where everything started, the first moment she had truly seen him, the first time she had let her guard down. It was hard to believe how much had changed since that evening. They had gone from strangers to something real, something unshakable. The bond between them had deepened in ways that neither of them had expected. And now, here they were again, standing on the threshold of a new chapter. But this time, It wasn't just the excitement of discovery that filled her chest. It was peace. "You remember this place?" Julian asked, pulling to a stop near the small, rustic building that overlooked the vineyard. The same place where they had danced and laughed, where the world had felt small and full of possibility. "I do," Nyla said, her voice soft, almost reverent. She stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath her feet as she walked toward the rows of vines. It was the same as she remembered, but different now. The air felt fresher, the colors more vibrant, and in her chest there was an unfamiliar calm that settled as soon as her feet hit the ground. "Come on," Julian said, his voice warm as he stepped beside her, offering her his hand. "Let's take a walk." They strolled through the vineyard, hand in hand, as the sun cast long shadows over the earth, painting everything in hues of orange and amber. The sound of crickets filled the air, blending with the distant chirps of birds. It was quiet here, in a way that felt far removed from their usual lives. There was no pressure, no eyes watching them, just the serenity of the land around them. Nyla breathed in deeply, taking in the earthy scent of the vines. "It's so peaceful here," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "I forgot how beautiful it is." "It's like time slows down," Julian said, looking at her with a soft smile. "I remember the first time we came here. It was the night of the wedding, and I had no idea that I was standing at the beginning of everything." Nyla looked up at him, meeting his gaze. "Me neither. I didn't think we'd end up here together." Julian squeezed her hand gently, his thumb brushing over her skin. "I didn't either. But now that we are, I can't imagine being anywhere else." They continued walking, the silence between them comfortable, unhurried. It was a contrast to the frantic pace of their lives, where every moment seemed filled with meetings, events, and responsibilities. Here, in the middle of the vineyard, everything felt more real, more raw. Eventually they reached the lake, its surface smooth and still, reflecting the sky above like a mirror. Julian led her to a large oak tree, its branches stretching out wide, offering shade and shelter. Beneath it, the ground was soft with fallen leaves, the perfect place to stop and rest. They sat down together, their backs against the trunk, and for a while they just watched the sun sink lower on the horizon, the colors changing from gold to deep purple. It was the kind of moment that felt timeless, a moment that could have lasted forever. Nyla leaned her head against Julian's shoulder, feeling the warmth of his body beside hers. "I never imagined this would be my life," she said quietly. "I never thought I'd be here, with you, in a place like this." "Why's that?" Julian asked, his voice low, curious. "I guess I never thought someone like me could fit into your world," she admitted, the words coming out easier than she expected. "I've spent my life fighting to be seen for who I am, not just what I've accomplished. And when we met, I didn't think it could work. I thought I'd always be on the outside." Julian turned to face her, his expression serious, his eyes soft. "You've never been on the outside to me, Nyla. You've always been the one who's shown me what really matters. You've made me see beyond the surface, and that's why I'm here." Her heart skipped a beat at his words, and she turned to meet his gaze, her eyes searching his face for any sign of hesitation. There was none. "You've changed everything for me," he continued, his voice soft but steady. "I've spent so long building a life based on success and image, but what I've realized is that none of that matters if I don't have someone to share it with. And I want that person to be you." Nyla's breath caught in her throat. She had heard Julian's words before, in different variations, but something about hearing him say it here, in this place that had always been so peaceful, made it feel more real than ever. She could feel her heart swelling in her chest, the weight of his words settling deep inside her. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, Julian stood up, taking her hands and pulling her to her feet. "Nyla," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I've spent so much of my life running from what really matters. But the moment I met you, I knew I had to stop running. I had to stop pretending like I could live in a world without you in it." His hands trembled as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Nyla's heart skipped a beat as he knelt down in front of her, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant diamond ring. "Nyla," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to build a future with you. Not just in the world I've known, but in the one we create together. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Nyla's eyes as she looked down at the ring, the sparkling diamond catching the last rays of the setting sun. She could feel the weight of the moment, the significance of it all. Julian wasn't just asking her to be a part of his life. He was asking her to walk beside him into the unknown, to build something new, something real. For a moment, everything else faded away. The vineyard, the world they had come from, even the uncertainties that had once held her back. It was just them, here, in this moment. And for the first time in her life, Nyla felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, Julian. I'll marry you." Julian's face lit up with a smile so wide and pure that it took her breath away. He stood up, pulling her into his arms, lifting her off the ground as he spun her around. The joy in his face mirrored her own, and as they kissed under the shade of the oak tree, the world around them seemed to disappear. They broke apart, their foreheads resting together, both of them laughing softly, the sound mingling with the rustling of the leaves above them. The future, once so uncertain, now seemed full of promise. As the last light of the day faded, they stood there together, hand in hand, the quiet of the vineyard surrounding them. It wasn't about grand gestures or extravagant celebrations. It was about the promise they had just made, to build a life together, to create something real, something lasting. And in that moment, Nyla knew, without a doubt, that they would make it work. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The world around them may have been full of noise, of expectations and pressure, but in this quiet moment, with Julian by her side, Nyla found clarity. She found her future. The morning of their wedding arrived with a quiet calm that Julian had never expected. The sun filtered through the window of the small house they had rented for the occasion, casting a soft golden glow across the room. Outside, the air was crisp, the world still wrapped in the quiet hush of early spring. Julian stood by the window, watching the world outside, his heart a strange mix of anticipation and peace. Today was the day they would take the step that would forever change their lives. He had spent so many years living in a world where everything had to be grand, polished, perfect. But today was about something different. It wasn't about the guests or the decorations. It wasn't about the opinions of his business partners or the expectations of his family. Today, it was just about them, just about Nyla and him. The wedding wasn't large. It wasn't a showpiece for the world to see. It was a small, intimate ceremony, with only close family and friends in attendance. No media, no flashing cameras, just love, just the people who mattered. And that was exactly how Julian wanted it. He took a deep breath, his hands slightly shaking as he adjusted the lavender tie that Nyla had picked out for him, just as he'd promised. She'd laughed when he had asked her to pick it, telling him it was a bit bold for a wedding, but he had insisted. Lavender. It was a color that meant something to him now, something simple, but beautiful. Something that reminded him of the promise he had made to her that night under the stars, a promise to stand by her, no matter what. Meanwhile, in another part of the house, Nyla stood in front of the full-length mirror, the gown she had designed herself flowing around her like a dream. It wasn't the most extravagant dress, but it was hers, every stitch, every detail. She had poured her heart into it, just as she had poured her heart into this relationship. The fabric shimmered in the light, soft and flowing, with delicate lace trimming the edges and a low back that felt effortlessly elegant. The dress fit her perfectly, hugging her curves just enough to make her feel beautiful, without feeling like someone she wasn't. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the fabric, a sense of awe washing over her. She had spent years dreaming of a day like this, imagining what it would feel like to be the center of someone's world. But what she had never imagined was that it would feel so grounded, so real. Julian had given her more than she ever thought possible. He had shown her that love didn't need to be flashy or grand, it just needed to be true. She glanced down at the small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself, the vibrant colors of daisies, lavender, and sunflowers, a perfect match for the simplicity of the day. "Nyla, are you ready?" Her sister Tasha appeared in the doorway, her voice filled with excitement. Nyla turned, meeting her sister's eyes in the mirror. Tasha's smile was wide, her eyes sparkling with the joy of the moment. "I think so," Nyla replied, her voice soft but steady. "It feels like a dream." Tasha stepped forward, adjusting Nyla's veil with a gentle touch. "It's not a dream, Nyla. It's your reality. You're marrying the man you love." Nyla smiled, a tear threatening to spill over. "I never thought it would happen. I didn't think I deserved this." "You deserve every bit of it," Tasha said firmly, her hands brushing away the tear that had escaped. "You've fought for everything in your life. Now you get to enjoy this moment with someone who truly sees you." Nyla nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. She had fought for everything, her independence, her career, her place in the world. But this was something entirely different. This was the kind of love she had never thought possible, the kind that made everything else fade into the background, the kind that made her feel truly seen, truly valued. "Let's go," Tasha said, her voice filled with anticipation. "He's waiting for you." Julian stood at the altar, his hands clenched at his sides as he tried to calm his racing heart. The room was filled with the soft hum of voices, but he couldn't focus on anything but the door. He had never been one for big displays, but this moment, this was different. He had no words for what he was feeling, no way to express just how much Nyla meant to him. The thought that she was about to walk down the aisle toward him, toward their future, was enough to overwhelm him. Then, the door opened. His breath caught in his chest as he turned to see Nyla standing there, her hand on her father's arm, her smile radiant, her eyes locked on him. She was perfect, more beautiful than he had ever imagined. Every step she took felt like it was happening in slow motion, and with every step, the space between them closed, the future that they would build together drawing closer. Julian's heart swelled with a quiet joy as he watched her walk toward him, her gown shimmering in the light. This was real. This was happening. And as she reached him, he took her hand, feeling the warmth of her touch, grounding him in the moment. "You look amazing," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Nyla smiled, her eyes shining with tears she refused to shed. "So do you," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, the weight of the world falling away. All that mattered was this moment, the two of them, together, ready to begin their life as partners. The ceremony was short, intimate, and filled with meaning. They exchanged vows that were simple but profound, promises to be there for each other through the highs and lows, to love and respect each other in all the ways that mattered. Julian's voice cracked as he spoke his vows, the words coming from a place deep within him that he hadn't fully realized existed until Nyla had come into his life. "I promise to always choose you," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "Not because it's easy, but because it's the only choice I want to make. I'll stand by you through everything, and I'll love you more every single day." Nyla's eyes filled with tears as she spoke her vows, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I promise to be your partner in everything, to support you, to trust you, to love you. No matter what life brings our way, we'll face it together. As they exchanged rings, a sense of finality settled over them, but it wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of everything. Later, after the ceremony, the small reception was filled with laughter, soft music, and the quiet joy of a group of people who truly cared for the couple. There were no speeches from high-powered business partners, no extravagant toasts, just friends and family who had gathered to celebrate love in its purest form. Julian and Nyla shared their first dance as husband and wife, their bodies swaying together, the music wrapping around them like a soft embrace. The world around them seemed to blur, the faces of the people watching fading into the background. All that mattered was the feeling of her hand in his, the warmth of her body pressed against his, and the promise they had just made. I still can't believe we're here, Nyla whispered, her cheek resting against his chest. Believe it, Julian replied, his voice thick with emotion. This is just the beginning. As the music played on, Julian held her close, the sense of peace he had been searching for finally settling deep within him. They were together. They had chosen each other. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Later that evening, as the last of their guests trickled out, Julian and Nyla stood on the balcony of the small house they had rented for the night. The moon hung low in the sky, its silver light casting a soft glow over the landscape. The vineyard, once a place of uncertainty, now felt like the perfect setting for the beginning of their forever. Do you think we're ready for this? Nyla asked softly, her voice tinged with the quiet joy of the day. We've been ready since the moment we met, Julian replied, pulling her close. We're in this together, Nyla. Always. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the future stretched out before them, full of unknowns, full of promise, but most of all, full of love. They had come so far, from strangers at a wedding to partners in life. And now, they were exactly where they were meant to be, together, ready to build a future, and proving that love wasn't about wealth, status, or approval. It was about finding someone who truly understood and accepted you. And that was exactly what they had found in each other. The beginning of forever.